All right, so get this. Big tech is going nuclear.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy.
Like a sci-fi movie or something.
Exactly, but it's actually happening. We've got some articles here.
Okay, cool.
One about this company called Met Group.
A Met Group?
Yeah, they're like a major player in the European energy scene.
Interesting.
And another article that talks about this whole trend of tech companies getting into nuclear power.
Huh. So it's not just like one isolated thing.
Nope, seems to be a bigger movement.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, and honestly, the more I read about this, the more questions I have.
Such as?
Well, like, why would these tech giants who are always pushing the boundaries of technology?
Right, always innovating.
Exactly.
Yes.
Why would they suddenly be interested in something as, like, old school as nuclear power?
Yeah, you'd think they'd be all about solar panels and wind farms, right?
Exactly.
Well, it's not as crazy as it might seem at first glance.
Okay, I'm listening.
Just think about the sheer amount of energy it takes to power our digital lives.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially with the rise of AI, it's absolutely mind-boggling.
One of these articles puts it into perspective with this crazy analogy.
Oh, I love a good analogy. Lay it on me.
Okay, so imagine the power your phone uses when you're streaming videos.
Right, or playing those like graphics-heavy games.
Exactly. Now multiply that by millions of users
Okay.
and then add in all the complex calculations AI needs to do.
It's got to be astronomical.
It really is.
No.
The article says that AI in the U.S. already accounts for 4% of the nation's total electricity consumption.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's like powering a small country just with algorithms.
That's insane, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, data centers, the backbone of the internet and AI,
Yeah,
they're running 24/7 processing and storing unimaginable amounts of data.
it's true. They're like these giant energy hogs.
No way around it. So the question becomes, how do we feed this insatiable hunger for energy?
Right, and how do we do it sustainably?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's where nuclear comes in.
Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about Microsoft reportedly reopening nuclear facilities.
Really?
Yeah, Google is exploring those small modular reactors, or SMRs.
I've heard about those.
And then Amazon is investing $500 million in nuclear-powered data centers.
Wow, so this is like a serious shift.
Right, it's a big departure from the renewables-only narrative we've been hearing for so long.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the logic here? Why the sudden nuclear pivot?
Right, spill the tea.
Well, it boils down to reliability.
Reliability.
Yeah, nuclear power provides a constant, stable stream of energy no matter the weather.
Okay, that's different from solar or wind.
Exactly. Those are intermittent sources. You can't always count on them.
Makes sense?
But nuclear plants, they're like the workhorses of the energy world, always churning out power.
I like that analogy.
It's like you have your trusty old pickup truck that starts every single time, no matter what.
Right.
That's nuclear power. Then you have your fancy sports car that might leave you stranded if the weather takes a turn.
Okay, got it.
That's your renewables.
So nuclear is reliable. But what about the cost? I mean, those power plants aren't cheap to build, are they?
That's true. The initial investment for nuclear can be higher,
Right.
but it often ends up being more cost-effective over the long haul.
Interesting, how so?
Well, especially when you factor in the cost of battery storage.
Because you need those for renewables.
Exactly. You need batteries to make solar and wind power reliable on a large scale.
Okay, so we've got reliability and long-term cost effectiveness in nuclear's corner, but let's be real, it's got a bit of a PR problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, Chernobyl, that's still a big one.
Totally. And this article points out that the U.S. went from being a major exporter of nuclear fuel to becoming a major importer.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic turnaround.
It is. So how do we reconcile that with this renewed interest in nuclear?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
These SMRs, the small modular reactors, they're changing the game.
So are we talking like nuclear power plant light?
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
Think of SMRs like those high-tech Lego sets.
Lego set.
Yeah, they're built in a factory and then shipped to the site and assembled.
So it's like a more streamlined process.
Exactly. It's much more efficient and potentially less risky than constructing those massive reactors on site.
Gotcha. So this modular approach is appealing.
Yeah, and that's a big part of why companies like Google and Amazon are so intrigued by SMRs.
Makes sense. So SMRs are like the cool new kid on the block, and big tech is taking notice.
It seems that way.
But what about this Met Group, the European company we talked about earlier?
Right.
Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, Met Group is a great example of how the energy landscape is evolving.
How so?
They've been heavily invested in natural gas, which is considered a transition fuel.
Right.
But they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Smart.
They created a whole division called Met Green.
Met Green.
Yeah, and they're focusing on developing renewable energy sources like wind and solar farms.
Okay, so they're doing both.
Exactly, they're diversifying.
And they're doing this across 9 European countries.
That's right. And they're even exploring battery storage solutions.
Which we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's all about managing the variability of renewables.
So even established energy players are getting in on the renewables game.
Big time. But let's talk about the market impact of this whole nuclear comeback for a sec.
Sure.
This article mentions that nuclear stocks are going through the roof. Uranium prices are at a 15-year high.
Wow.
And companies like NuScale Power, Cameco, NextGen, they're all riding this wave.
Sounds like a gold rush.
It kind of is. It's a clear sign that investors are recognizing the potential of nuclear energy.
And it's not just private companies, right? Governments are getting involved too.
Absolutely. India is planning to triple its nuclear capacity by 2032.
We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, and they're aiming for 25% of their electricity to come from nuclear by 2050.
Ambitious.
Very different. Companies like REC and NTPC are pouring trillions of rupees into this transition.
So it seems like SMRs are really shaking things up globally.
They definitely are.
Okay, so we've got big tech, traditional energy players, even governments jumping on the nuclear bandwagon. It's a pretty diverse group.
It is. But are we getting carried away with the hype?
Good question.
Is nuclear really the answer to all our energy woes?
I wouldn't say it's that simple.
So it's not going to single-handedly save the day for AI and climate change.
It's not a magic bullet.
Okay, so what are the caveats?
Well, there are still some serious hurdles to overcome.
Like what?
Well, regulatory hurdles are a big one.
Right, getting approval for nuclear facilities can't be easy.
It's a complex process, even for these smaller SMRs.
And then there's public perception.
Yeah, after Chernobyl and Fukushima, people are understandably cautious about nuclear.
For sure.
And what about the cost?
True. Even if SMRs are designed to be cheaper, there's always a risk of cost overruns with new tech.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, focusing too much on nuclear could take away resources and attention from renewables.
Right, like solar and wind.
Yeah, those have already made so much progress.
So it's not a silver bullet solution. Not at all. We need to be cautiously optimistic about nuclear.
Cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, it has the potential to be a major player in clean energy.
Right.
But it's not a magic fix. It needs to be part of a broader, more diverse energy strategy.
So it's not nuclear versus renewables.
Right.
It's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. The energy landscape is evolving rapidly.
Yeah.
And the future is probably going to be much more diverse and decentralized than we think.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from AI's energy needs to big tech's nuclear ambitions, the rise of SMRs, the evolving role of traditional energy players. What are your initial thoughts on all of this?
You know, it's funny how quickly things can change.
What do you mean?
Well, just a few years ago, it was like you couldn't even talk about nuclear energy.
Yeah, it was practically a taboo subject.
Right. Everyone was so focused on renewable.
And nuclear was basically considered a relic of the past.
Yeah, it was like the shadow of Chernobyl and Fukushima had just completely doomed nuclear power.
It's true, those accidents had such a profound impact.
And understandably so, they were devastating events.
But now it seems like we're seeing a potential nuclear renaissance.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
So what's driving this shift? Is it just the advancements in technology with those SMRs, or is there something else going on?
Well, it's definitely a combination of factors.
Okay, like what?
Well, on the tech side, those SMRs offer a lot of advantages over traditional nuclear plants.
We talked about that a bit earlier.
Right. They're smaller, more modular, and potentially safer.
And easier to build and transport.
Exactly. They can be built in factories and shipped to where they're needed.
Like giant Lego sets.
Kind of. Yeah, it's a much more streamlined process.
So that modularity makes them more appealing to investors and regulators.
Definitely. And it also makes them more versatile.
How so?
Well, they can be deployed in more locations.
Because they're not as massive.
Right. And they can be scaled up or down to meet specific energy needs.
So they're kind of like the customizable plug-and-play version of nuclear power.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
So it sounds like SMRs could be a game changer, but I'm guessing there are still concerns about safety.
Of course, safety is always the top priority with nuclear energy.
Especially given the history.
Right. But proponents of SMR say that they're designed to be inherently safer.
How so?
Well, for one thing, many SMRs are designed to passively shut down in case of an emergency.
So they don't need human intervention.
Or external power sources. It's like a built-in safety net.
Okay, but what about the issue of nuclear waste? That's always been a big concern.
Absolutely. It's a valid concern.
So has there been any progress on that front?
Well, some SMR designs actually produce less waste than traditional reactors.
That's good.
And there's ongoing research into advanced recycling technologies that could minimize the waste even further.
So there's hope for a more sustainable solution.
There's definitely potential there.
Okay, so it seems like SMRs are addressing some of the major concerns about nuclear power.
They're trying to.
But let's talk about the economic implications of this potential nuclear revival. This article mentions that nuclear stocks are surging. Uranium prices are going through the roof.
It's a sign that investors are taking this seriously.
Yeah, they're betting big on the future of nuclear.
And it's not just private companies, governments are getting involved too.
We talked about India earlier.
Right, they're making massive investments in nuclear power.
Are there other countries doing the same?
Definitely. China is investing heavily with plans to build tons of new reactors.
Wow.
The UK is committed to nuclear too, with several new plants under construction.
Interesting.
And even countries that were scaling back their nuclear programs, like France and Japan.
Right.
They're reconsidering their positions now.
So it really does seem like a global trend.
It does.
But this raises a question. What does this shift towards nuclear mean for renewable energy?
Like solar and wind.
Exactly. Are they going to be pushed aside?
That's a big debate right now.
Because some people are worried that investing in nuclear will take away from renewables.
Right. That it will create competition between two different energy pathways.
And that nuclear might get prioritized even though renewables have come so far.
Those are valid concerns.
So is it an either situation?
Well, not necessarily. Some people argue that nuclear and renewables can actually work together.
Like a peanut butter and jelly situation.
Kind of, yeah. They see it as more of a synergistic relationship.
Okay, so instead of competing, they can complement each other.
Exactly. Nuclear can provide a stable baseload of electricity.
Like a constant supply.
Right, and then renewables can fill in the gaps and meet peak demand.
So it's like a more balanced approach.
It could make the whole energy system more resilient and sustainable.
That makes sense, but I imagine it's not easy to integrate nuclear and renewables effectively.
Well, the grid infrastructure might need some upgrades.
To handle the different characteristics of each energy source.
Right, and we'll need clear policies that encourage both nuclear and renewables.
So it's a complex challenge.
It is, but it's encouraging to see that people are recognizing that we need all the tools we can get.
To tackle the energy challenges of the future.
Exactly. It's not about picking winners and losers.
It's about finding the right mix of solutions.
To meet our growing needs and address climate change.
Well said. Now, what about you? What do you think about all of this? Do you see nuclear and renewables as competitors or collaborators? Where do you think the balance lies? It's kind of wild how this nuclear thing is playing out differently around the world.
Yeah.
We've talked about the U.S. and India.
Right.
But what about Europe? They've always had a more complicated relationship with nuclear, haven't they?
Oh, for sure. Europe is like a patchwork of different opinions on nuclear power.
How so?
Well, you've got countries like France.
Yeah.
They're super pro-nuclear. They get a huge chunk of their electricity from reactors.
Right.
And then you have places like Germany.
Mm-hmm.
They've been way more hesitant. They're phasing out nuclear and going all in on renewables.
Makes sense.
And of course, the memory of Chernobyl is still fresh in a lot of people's minds in Europe.
Yeah, that definitely casts a long shadow over the whole nuclear debate.
And Fukushima didn't help either.
Back in 2011.
Right. That really fueled the anti-nuclear sentiment in parts of the world.
So it seems like the accidents had a lasting impact.
Definitely. But here's the thing. The energy landscape is shifting again.
You mean with climate change?
Exactly. And the limitations of relying solely on renewables are becoming more obvious.
So some countries are reconsidering nuclear?
Yeah, it's this balancing act between energy security, environmental concerns, and what the public thinks.
Right, and it's interesting how even companies that are really into renewables are starting to acknowledge that nuclear could have a role to play.
Yeah.
Like Met Group, that European company we mentioned earlier.
Right, they're big on wind and solar.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
this article highlights that they're also investing a ton in battery storage tech.
It's like they're hedging their bets.
Yeah, covering all their bases.
They're realizing that a mix of energy sources is key.
For a truly sustainable energy future.
Exactly, and battery storage is becoming more and more important.
Because of the whole intermittency thing with renewables.
Yeah, wind and solar aren't always available, so you need a way to store the energy for when you need it.
So battery storage is like a buffer.
Right. It helps to smooth out the ups and downs of energy supply and demand.
It sounds kind of like solving a giant puzzle.
It kind of is, trying to make all the pieces fit together.
And there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Nope. Every country has its own challenges and opportunities.
So what works for France might not work for Germany.
Exactly. And what works for India might not work for the US,
It's all about finding the right mix.
based on their specific needs and resources.
Okay, so it sounds like nuclear is making a comeback, but it's not going to take over the whole energy landscape.
Right. It's going to be one part of a much bigger and more complex energy ecosystem.
And that future could include all sorts of things.
Yeah, nuclear renewables, maybe even new technologies we haven't even thought of yet.
It's hard to predict where it's all going.
It really is. But one thing's for sure, we need to move away from this idea of one energy source being the winner.
It's not a competition.
Exactly. The future of energy is probably going to be much more diverse and decentralized than we can imagine right now.
And let's not forget about energy efficiency.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
It's not just about making more energy, it's about using what we have more wisely,
Totally. It's got to be a holistic approach,
looking at the entire energy picture.
from production to consumption.
And it's going to take everyone working together.
Governments, industries, communities, individuals, we all have a role to play.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the wild world of tech and nuclear energy, what's the key takeaway?
For me, it's that the energy landscape is constantly changing.
Yeah, it's like a moving target.
Exactly. The old rules are being rewritten and new possibilities are popping up all the time.
So it's an exciting time to be paying attention to this stuff.
It definitely is. And remember, your role in this is crucial.
You mean staying informed?
Exactly. And staying engaged, asking questions. The choices we make today are going to affect the energy landscape for years to come.
Well said. So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep an open mind as we navigate this crazy energy future.
I like that.
And hey, if you come across any cool articles or research on this topic, let us know.
Yeah, we're always up for another deep dive.
Until next time.